Welcome to Talking Netflix. I'm your host, Rascal F. Kennedy.
I'm Mark Tan, the managing critic of Full Circle Cinema.
Hi, I'm James Preston Poole. I'm the lead critic of Full Circle Cinema.
Hi, I'm Katie Gelstrap. I'm a critic and features writer for Full Circle Cinema.
Today on our podcast, we are going to talk about Enola Holmes, The Devil All the Time, featuring a very interesting Robert Pattinson performance, and Ratched. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Ratched.
Okay. It's starring Sarah Paulson, and she has, from what I've seen, because I haven't watched it yet, James and Mark have. From what I've heard, it's a very good performance. So I'm interested in hearing this.
I have a lot to say on that one, but first I'm going to go ahead and mute myself so y'all can talk about Enola Holmes.
Just like James muted himself, I'm pretty sure we're going to get very spoilery. So if you haven't seen it, I suggest you kind of dodge this part. Mark, I guess we'll start with you, bro.
Enola Holmes is definitely an interesting take on typical mystery plot in that, for one thing, we are following Sherlock Holmes. While he is in this, and we do see him a lot, and he is very jacked because he's played by Henry Cavill, we're not following Sherlock Holmes, we're following Enola, played by Millie Bobby Brown. The thing about this movie is that it's very clever and it tries to be clever in terms of how it presents its story, because the story's pretty basic. It's just Enola trying to figure out where her mom is, played by Helena Bonham Carter. And while the basis of that plot is simple, the way that this movie's told is very upbeat and lively. One of the things that this movie does is basically have a lot of fourth wall breaks in that Enola just addresses the audience nearly every other scene. And I think that strategy is interesting to a point because it's definitely an easy way that the audience get engaged in the story. But I think the problem with doing that all the time is that sometimes it just feels like the movie doesn't really want to tell its story normally, and it tends to ride too much on Brown as a performer. I think the issue with this is that this director, Harry Bradbeer, one of the things that he's most known for is directing nearly every episode of the Amazon show Fleabag. I think because this movie's trying to be like that TV show, I couldn't really stop thinking about that show and not the story at hand, because at some point the story, it kind of doesn't matter. It just becomes about Enola learning more about the world and her addressing the audience more. And I will admit, I did enjoy this movie a fair amount, but because of all the times that it addresses the audience, oddly enough, it was the one thing that actually kept me distant from it emotionally because of how much the movie's just willing to show all her ridiculous reactions to certain things. And on the whole, it's okay. It wasn't a movie that I really loved, but I thought it was just fine. I know Katie's about to say something.
I gave it a 10 out of 10. So that was my opinion. I did write the review for this movie for Full Circle Cinema, and maybe it was because I haven't seen Fleabag that I didn't have quite as much of an, not necessarily adverse, but adverse reaction to the fourth wall breaks. I thought it was a neat characteristic. Sherlock Holmes has always been one of my favorite mystery personnel, and we get a touch of Enola in the Benedict Cumberbatch series on BBC, but we don't get quite the same character here. The way Enola acts in that show doesn't compare to this. She mirrors very similar off of Sherlock. And in Sherlock, you see Benedict Cumberbatch, he's like writing in there, he's thinking, like walking back and forth while doodles come up around him. And that's kind of his own way of visualizing that he's processing. And in the Robert Downey Jr. movies, you see him like slow down time and walk through a fight or walk through a problem before he actually gets to that point. That's the movie's way of visualizing how he's processing his thoughts and trying to display him as something different than the typical detective you would see on screen is. For me, the fourth wall breaking was very similar to that, and it was a good way to differentiate her from other portrayals, but still kind of go in that same flow, I feel like, because it looked like it was her way of processing, like her talking to the audience. It was her way of working through a problem. So that's kind of how I took that. I really love this movie. It's a bundle of joy. It's bright, it's honest. And while it doesn't take on the full genre of mystery, it's still a very good mystery. It's definitely more of a coming of age story and trying to find your own place in the world. So yeah, I find myself so rarely thinking that I actually want a sequel because of how much fun I had in the movie. Recently, more of my sequel needs have been because I don't get enough of the plot in the actual movie itself, or I want more background, where I wanted a sequel purely because I didn't understand some dynamics in the movie. So this movie, I fully support getting a sequel just because of how much fun I had with it and wanting to experience more of that. I think it's perfectly fine without a sequel, but that just kind of tells me how much this movie spoke to me. So,
All right, Rascal, where do you stand in all of this?
So I'm leaning more towards Katie. I thought it was a really good coming of age movie, especially with young Tewksbury. His story and Enola's story kind of mirrored each other in a way, and I appreciated it. Introduction to Enola Holmes, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't even know she existed as a character in the Sherlock Holmes universe, world, whatever we're gonna call it. And I also didn't know about his brother Mycroft. I thought it was a very interesting movie. I thought that Henry Cavill's portrayal of Sherlock Holmes was good. He wasn't as arrogant as the Sherlock Holmes that we get from Robert Downey Jr. He seemed more humble, more down to earth, and a very caring person. And that showed throughout the whole movie. He tried not to show it. Eventually it came out. And I feel like that is one reason that I like this movie so much, is because I have a niece we're not far in age from each other. She's like a little sister to me rather than a niece. So I feel like that kind of was part of the reason that I liked this movie so much, was because he cared about her more than Mycroft did. And he actually showed it. He actually tried to do things. He let her grow up and kind of make her own mistakes instead of trying to pull her before the world and make her be what they thought a woman should be in the 1800s, which that's another point to hit at, is the feminist background of the whole story and the plot that you get within Enola Holmes. I feel like I'm just putting words together right now.
I think everything you said is valid. One of the things that I do find really interesting about this version of both Sherlock Holmes and Mycroft Holmes is that they are basically parental figures of a sort. And it feels like Mycroft is almost like the really servant, really caring, almost this maternal figure for Enola, who really tries to restrict what she can do and just make her follow the strict rules that a lady should follow. Whereas Sherlock is not as present as Mycroft, but whenever he is a huge authority. It's telling that a huge portion of the drama is based on who will be her ward and how Enola's going to react to that. So seeing the various relationships that Enola has with her two brothers, at least for me, I thought that was easily the most interesting thing in the movie.
it's funny, Rascal, that you mentioned like the Sherlock emotions. So I think we wouldn't do it justice if we didn't mention the lawsuit from Arthur Conan Doyle's estate, because Sherlock Holmes, quote unquote, did not have emotions until 1923 to 1927, which are still under copyright law. So that's been a big scandal because of the ridiculous lawsuit.
It just sounds petty and childish.
The movie really does not work if you don't have a caring Sherlock Holmes who is kind of stuck into himself in a sort. Like he's stuck behind a shadow and saying, okay, I have to have this image for news people and like my detective image and everything. But yet the movie doesn't work if he doesn't step in at key points to provide Enola a way out or give her extra information.
This movie doesn't make sense without an emotional Sherlock Holmes. So I definitely agree. I think the other thing that we should pinpoint is the actual plot of the movie. I don't know. I thought it was interesting.
There's a lot that's happening. It starts being about the story of Enola and her relationship with her mother, and that's being tested by the fact that her mother is left for no apparent reason. But what's interesting is that that particular thread kind of goes by the wayside in favor of the subplot with Tewksbury, because as you said earlier, the character arcs for both Enola and Tewksbury are pretty similar. So the fact that they spend a lot of the time with each other throughout the movie is certainly interesting. And another interesting point, particularly about Enola's mother, is when we find out some of the things that she's done in the past couple days, particularly with Enola's discovery of her being a huge part of this suffrage movement, because of course this is at a time when women's voting was not much of a thing back then. So this was definitely an example of that character being this progressive figure and how something like that would translate over to Enola.
I think the plot with the mother is still kind of built in. And it's mainly because of the fourth wall break where Enola comes in and she says, never let a man dictate your path. And then she says, but my mom also said, build your own path. So she kind of makes her own decision there. And that kind of, it does leave the mom plot to the side, but it's built in really well to encompass the coming of age portion and Enola building her own path. So I think that really works. While it does leave it by the wayside, I think it works.
I definitely think that it works because I think they made her mom disappearing and her looking for her mom a big part of the story. But I don't think that that was intentionally supposed to be what the movie was actually about. I think it was supposed to be about Enola solving her first mystery, which was the whole situation with Tewksbury. So I think that was more so supposed to be the focus of the movie. And a lot of people, including us, we got kind of wrapped up in the mom thing because that's what Netflix actually pushed.
And it's also the first thing that the movie focuses on. So it's easy to spend a lot of time on that and not so much on the Tewksbury mystery, which is fairly interesting. It's just that it takes a long time before it actually gets there. I definitely understand why people reacted the way they did, and the movie works well enough. But the way it is, it's just that I definitely don't blame people for not spending a lot of time thinking about the Tewksbury stuff.
It's hard to focus on the Tewksbury thing because the first thing that you get hit in the face with is her mom disappearing. And then they kind of focus on that, and then they throw Tewksbury out there, and then you focus on that, and then you realize and remember, oh yeah, her mom. I think that was probably the only flaw, was that they tried to do too much at once. I think if you focus on her mom and then make a sequel with Tewksbury, you get a better flow.
I would agree with that because I do think both stories are pretty interesting, and I definitely like seeing how Enola tried to disguise herself from others. It's just that I think the movie kind of forgets about one thing or another at certain points. It was a little bit hard for me to figure out what was the more important thing as a whole, even though the end makes it very clear that it was very much about Enola solving her first mystery. But definitely along the way, it kind of made things a little too muddled for my tastes.
I definitely understand. Before we move on, do we go ahead and give these ratings?
Before we do that, one thing that I did want to just give a special shout out to is I want to spotlight one particular actor, and that's Bern Gorman, who seems to just be in movies just to play villains. And that's what he is again. And I just like seeing him anytime he's on screen, even though I do wish he wasn't so typecast. But I don't know, I just always get a lot of enjoyment whenever he's around.
And unfortunately, there are those actors who that's just their thing. We throw them in movies to play and do one simple thing, but they have a really wide range and we just don't know it. I guess I'll start with the ratings. I give it an 8 out of 10.
I gave it a 10 out of 10, and I'm sticking with my 10 out of 10.
I'll make this average into an 8 by giving it a 6 out of 10 because I did enjoy this movie. I'm not going to act like there aren't things that I loved, particularly Sam Claflin as Mycroft. I just thought he was perfect for the role. Even though I already like Sam Claflin as an actor from things like the Hunger Games movies, this is probably my favorite thing that he's done because of just how much he committed to being this overprotective, obnoxious person. But as I said earlier, for the most part, I thought it was just okay, and for that, I'll just give it a 6 out of 10.
And I'm giving it an I did not watch this movie out of 10. So, guess that's going to be an 8.
Katie, are you going to stay with us or are you going to...
It's past my bedtime. I'm sorry. I'm old.
Oh, it's fine.
Good night.
Good night, Katie.
Good night.
No worries.
So, Devil All the Time, starring Bill Skarsgård, Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, and more.
That's a good start. They're definitely in it, and there's a lot of other people, and we're probably going to talk about them all.
I'm very surprised that Netflix didn't manage to slip MGK in there.
Honestly, dude, it's not even that far-fetched.
It was either going to be this or Project Power, and he decided to be in Project Power.
He should have decided to be in this.
I don't know about that, and we'll get to why once we start discussing the movie.
For those of you who have or have not seen it and just decided to roll with us just to listen, if you have not seen The Devil All the Time, this is the plot. Sinister characters converge around a young man devoted to protecting those he loves in a post-war backwoods town teeming with corruption and brutality. Antonio Campos directed this film, and Mr. Antonio Campos also directed a whole lot of nothing.
I believe he directed a movie called Christine, but since it's not the car movie, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, he directed a movie called Christine. Yeah, no, it's not the car movie from Stephen King. He also directed an episode of The Punisher. He directed a TV series called The Sinner and another TV series called Homemade, among other things that I've never, ever seen. Has anybody seen anything that he's directed?
No, but I've heard of him. I know that he definitely has his fan base.
According to IMDb, this movie has 7.1 stars out of 10, and on Metacritic, it's got a grade of 55.
Okay, well, that seems more accurate.
I guess I'll go first. I enjoyed this movie in a very disturbing way. I wish I didn't enjoy this movie. The very beginning of the movie was kind of confusing to navigate for me personally. The narrator, played by Donald Ray Pollock, his voice just kind of guides you. And I think that's the one thing that helped me with this movie was Donald Ray Pollock's voice. He kind of just guided the movie, and he does a pretty damn good job. He's no Morgan Freeman, but he definitely does a really good job at narrating and navigating this movie. The acting performances in this movie were brilliant. I loved every acting performance in this film, from Bill Skarsgård, who plays Willard, who is Arvin's father. I really liked Willard. He sets a good example for his son. Well, I wouldn't say good example, because at the end of the day, yikes. He sets an example for his son that his son follows throughout his entire life. If you've seen the movie, you know exactly what I'm getting at. The one thing that disturbs me about this movie is Robert Pattinson. His Southern accent is not a Southern accent. It's an accent that he made up on his own. I don't know where he comes from. I don't know who this guy is or what he does. But the accent is so flawed, it's crazy. But other than that, he puts on a really, really good performance as a really, really creepy guy. And Reverend Preston Teagarden is a very sick guy. If you've seen the movie, I don't even really want to get into Robert Pattinson's character, but that character in general is what makes the movie good to me. It's just that you can have such a sinister, disturbing character in a film like this, and people love it. I think that was one of the main things that people highlighted on the internet was his character. But I'm hogging up a lot of time, so I'll let James go next.
I 100% agree with you that if there's one great thing about this movie, it's Robert Pattinson. I actually love his accent because I think it's just so ridiculous and over the top, but also kind of creepy at the same time. And I think Robert Pattinson does show what kind of works about the movie, which is that it has this incredibly dark, unsettling tone, and it's committed to being disturbing. Now, on paper, The Devil All the Time, it has everything I should love in a movie. It's got a phenomenal ensemble cast. The cinematography is phenomenal. The directing is so confident. The whole project really just seems to have this boldness to it that I really dig. The problem is none of it really meant anything. This movie reveled in misery and disturbing content for the sake of having disturbing content. And we'll get into more of that in the spoiler section. But there was just death and horrible things happening to these characters for no reason other than bad stuff happens. Which, okay, I guess, but then the movie tries to wrap it up in this religious theme that really doesn't say anything about religion other than religion's bad, which might have been a really revolutionary concept if they had released this movie in the 1950s, but it's 2020. This has been done to death. I think this movie overall at the end just kind of crumbles from its plot lines, not really amounting to much and not saying anything to us other than, of course, religion bad, and these characters are really messed up people. And that made me really dislike this movie. It just left a bad taste in my mouth.
I definitely see your point. I can't argue against that because this is something that's been done over and over and over again. It was an interesting way to do it, but overall, you're not wrong.
No, and I'm not against dark content. I don't believe that this sort of content needs to be censored or shouldn't be made. I just think it should have kind of more of a point.
There definitely should have been a better point driven home. I think that was maybe my one argument against this movie. It was just kind of like, oh, okay, that. We'll talk about it in the spoiler section. But yeah, once they get to the end of the movie, there was really no point to drive home. You kind of already knew that from the beginning whenever you watch the characters get introduced.
They could have gotten to a point by maybe a better edit of the movie, or maybe just like doing one more draft of the script could have gotten us to where we needed to be. But right now, it just lacked focus.
Both of you have nailed pretty much what I thought about this movie. It's definitely an unsettling movie, and it's very good at being unsettling. Antonio Campos is very confident as a director in terms of creating this really ugly atmosphere. All the performances are really terrific, and I do like that even though it's not saying a lot, I definitely got the intended feeling of all these people are really messed up, and sometimes I'm okay with that. And even though, yes, it's not saying much, I still was very much engaged with what was happening. One thing that James nailed, though, is that this absolutely needs another edit. Not so much to add material to it, because I wasn't super bothered by the fact that it doesn't have that much to say. I was bothered by the fact that it is over 2 hours long. There are certain scenes in this that are disturbing for no real reason. There's one particular subplot that I want to touch on, and we're going to touch on that later, but safe to say that it's a little odd that it takes 45 minutes to get to Tom Holland, who is ostensibly the main character of the movie. Another thing that annoyed me was something that I actually don't agree with you on, Rascal, is the narration. While I do agree that the narration is good at giving you a sense of what's happening in this world, I think it's too good at that, because often whenever the narration comes up, it's just explaining something that we already know. For example, there's one moment where a character's looking through a person's trash, and as this is happening, we hear the narrator saying, "This person was very careful about preserving all this material. That's why it took so long for this to actually be in the trash." And it just kept doing that throughout the movie, and it really annoyed me, because I think the movie's very good at showing us what the characters are like and what their situations are. I don't need this narrator to be on all the time to be here. I understand why this particular narrator's here, because this particular narrator did the book of this that serves as its source material. But if you really wanted to get the great version of The Devil All the Time, you would take out at least 2/3 of the narration, and you take out 2 or 3 different subplots. If this were a movie that was an hour and a half about how religion is bad and how the people can be really messed up, I would have zero qualms with it. But since it's over 2 hours long, it does get to a point where it is fatiguing, even though there's nothing in it that's technically bad. As I said, the cinematography is really good and the actors are really good. But as it is, what could have been this really fantastic movie, it's just instead a good one.
Yeah, there was a lot that could have been cut out of the movie, so I do not agree with you. There was really a lot that could have gone out of this movie and we would have been perfectly okay. The beginning of the movie could have been cut out. They could have just given us a backstory. Some of the narration could have been cut out. There definitely should have been another draft of the script. A lot of editing could have been done too.
I kind of disagree about a lot of the first part being cut out, because I think some of the material with Bill Skarsgård is some of the stronger and more confident material in the movie. There's an incident early in the movie that happens with a priest basically thinking he has more power than he does. And that was chilling. Like, it was so terrifying what ended up happening. And the fact that they let that just play out in slow time was great. I think the problem was they should have had maybe an equal amount of screen time for Skarsgård and Tom Holland if they were trying to do a passing the generational torch kind of thing. Because right now, it just kind of seems like a Tom Holland movie with a random Bill Skarsgård prologue to it.
I get what you're saying, because it could have just been a first half, second half kind of movie. It was almost like Inglourious Basterds, where you get the introduction of the evil general and then you get the rest of the movie. But it wasn't like that. It was like, here's this long Bill Skarsgård entrade in the first act, and then here's Tom Holland in the back half of the movie. So I definitely do get your point.
Yeah, and unlike Inglourious Basterds, which goes back and forth between the bastards and the main character, Shoshana, this one, it's basically just Tom Holland from 45 minutes to the very end, with a couple of detours along the way with certain characters that I don't know really had to be there. I think, James, you did make a really good point to where if this were really about the generational parallels, it would have been equal screen time, whether it be when the first half of the movie is Bill Skarsgård, or in the second half of the movie about Tom Holland, or the whole movie was basically going back and forth between them. Yeah, that's definitely another thing that could have made this movie really great.
I think also, Mark, you did bring up a couple characters that didn't necessarily need to be here. Are you talking about the characters played by Riley Keough and Jason Clarke?
Yes.
I'm going to drop a hot take on those characters. I think those two characters represent a better movie that could have been. So much of the religious imagery gives this movie a self-importance, but whenever we're with those two serial killer characters, we almost get just this bleak life is hell movie that works on its own, and I kind of wish we had a lot more of that.
I do agree that if this movie were entirely different and if it was just about them, their actions would not be so uncomfortable to watch, because it's just something different when your movie is fairly sinister but not so graphic. Then you cut back to them and just get this overly cruel and explicit scenes that are definitely memorable. I'll give them that. And Jason Clarke and Riley Keough are very good in those roles. I definitely bought them as these criminals. It's just a thing that it did not really fit that well with the rest of the movie. And I could say a similar thing about Sebastian Stanton's cop character, because while there is certainly a connection between that subplot and the other ones surrounding it, again, it just makes the movie slow down more than it needs to.
Absolutely.
I think that the serial killers and the priest, I think it fits into the movie only because it helps build Arvin as a character. If it doesn't contribute to Arvin, then I don't think that it should count. But since those three characters contribute to Arvin, I think that it is indeed necessary in the movie. Now, do I think they could have went another way about it, or they could have kind of changed the subplots a little bit? Yes. But I personally feel like they do fit.
I can totally see how it would work. I guess it just really didn't come together for me. And I think a part of that might be that I just didn't particularly find Arvin to be that great a protagonist. What would this movie have been like if it had been all about Bill Skarsgård, or it had been from the point of view of the serial killers who were killing people to feel like closer to God? Or like, what if it was Robert Pattinson as the lead character? I don't know. I feel like for a movie that's so bleak, like, yes, Arvin was a darker character, they still kind of copped out in making him as relatable as he was. For a movie that wants us really to see evil, I feel like it almost didn't engage with it in any meaningful way. It just kind of showed us a lot of really bleak and disturbing situations rather than actually taking us within the head of the people involved in those situations.
It does feel like the character of Arvin is mainly there just to introduce and tie all the other subplots together, because without the character of Arvin, these really could have been separate movies. But I guess just because of what the book was, this is how it had to be, and Compost did not really want to strive that much away from that. I still got a lot out of this movie just from the little bits it was, but do see how a movie filled with bits does not quite equal a whole, if that makes any sense.
What do y'all think? Do you think this movie would have worked a lot better as a Netflix series? Because I feel like so much would have been corrected by making that pivot.
That's how I feel about Enola Holmes,
Ooh,
but not about Devil All the Time.
interesting.
That's how I feel about The Devil All the Time, but not Enola Holmes. I think Enola Holmes works perfectly as a movie. Something like The Devil All the Time really would have benefited from a miniseries.
And I have no opinion because I have not seen Enola Holmes yet.
Do we want to go ahead and get into spoilers real quick before we move on?
Let's do some brief spoilers because I kind of want to talk about the moment in the movie that really kind of turned me off of it.
The things that I found disturbing was the priest murdering his wife, Willard offing himself in the woods because his wife had died, and the priest, man, Robert Pattinson.
He's a reverend, and every negative thing that you can think of that a reverend can do, he pretty much does. And he definitely spends a lot of time around girls that are far too young for him. And yeah, I think that's about it. I think that's as best you could sum it up, really.
As disturbing as he was, I feel like that's one of the other moments like that in the serial killers where the tone is used excellently. I feel like Robert Pattinson's character was just as disturbing as he needed to be. And I wanted to see this war between him and Arvin continue because there was a movie there. That conflict didn't go on anywhere near enough for me because, as we all know, Arvin just caps Robert Pattinson like it's nothing. The moment for the movie that really, though, showed me that a lot of it was just more in the service of being edgy than telling a great story was whenever Eliza Scanlen's character, Lenora, who's Arvin's adopted sister, whenever she's about to hang herself and then has a change of heart and then accidentally kicks the bucket, I was like, come on, did we need that? It's like they tried to just make the situation as miserable as possible to the point where it felt like a parody, but it wasn't funny.
And speaking of which, the one thing that I had in my mind was the opening of Swiss Army Man, where Paul Dano's character does the same thing, except that one really is played for laughs because he doesn't actually die. It's just that he hangs for a few seconds, but then he's okay. But with this one, like the rest of the movie, is played completely straight and completely serious. It takes this horrifying moment and it gives it an almost goofy edge that it should not have whatsoever.
I feel like we're trying to just make it dark, just to make it dark. Look how disturbing we can make this movie. Not, hey, let's give this movie an actual good plot and drive home a point. It's like they missed the whole idea of a movie. It's not just to give us images, but it's to give us a story that we can follow out and have an ending we can be at peace with. No matter how bad or good the ending is in terms of moral standpoint, it's about us being able to come to terms with the ending. And while I was able to come to terms with the ending, I wasn't sure what the plot was. There are evil people in the church. I mean, if anybody is paying attention to what's happening with the election and our politics in America right now, we all know that evil people go to church. I don't think that that's something that you have to kind of dangle over our heads for us to understand. But there could have been a much better point to drive home other than that.
And the point could have even been that there is no point. And it could have been about just the intertwining of like religion and violence, and that would have been enough. But the movie carries itself in such a way where you feel like there has to be something bigger. And it really just set itself up for failure.
So I guess we'll go ahead and we'll get on these ratings real quick. I'll say a 7 out of 10. I mean, the only complaint that I really have is the actual disturbing nature of some points in the movie and the fact that there's not a point driven home. But I mean, other than that, it was a wild ride for the most part.
I can definitely see that. Through talking to y'all, I came in here ready to give this a 3 out of 10 just because I was really not with this movie, but I think it has enough virtue to it. And like they did try to make something good, and there's a lot to love here. I'm going to go ahead and give it a 5 out of 10.
I'm really unsure what range to give this because before recording this, I basically flipped back and forth between giving this a 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10. And I'm not going to allow myself to give a 0.5 rating. So because of how much of an impression it left on me emotionally, I'll give it the 7. But let me be clear and say that it's definitely on the lower end of the 7 out of 10s that I've given these past couple months to movies because it is a movie that needs work and either add more to it, add an actual message, or make it 90 minutes and just get out of here. Because what this is right now, I'm not completely vibing with it, even though certainly on a technical level, I have nothing to complain about.
Does that average out to?
You're 6.6. I think it's a 6.3.
All right, so that kind of meshes with what we were saying. There's enough there that it should skew positive.
So we were less positive than IMDb.
They can't all be the kissing booth, y'all.
Unfortunately, they cannot. All right, so I guess I'll go ahead and mute myself so you guys can talk Ratched.
Let me pull up the IMDb summary of this. Ratched is somewhat of a prequel / reimagining of the central villain of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. Ratched is set in 1947, where Mildred Ratched begins working as a nurse at a leading psychiatric hospital, but beneath her stylish exterior lurks a growing darkness. I guess I'll go ahead and start. Ryan Murphy is far from my favorite creative. I feel like he makes really pretty shows that kind of regurgitate the same themes he's been working with in most of his series, just without wherewithal to follow through with his ideas. But by collaborating with Evan Romansky, he made something I find just delicious. It's just pure pulp television, and I love every second of it. It's got everything you wanted. It's got beautiful cinematography, wonderfully over-the-top performances, twists and turns galore like it's a soap opera, and it wonderfully melds horror and romance, and it's just everything you could want. The only failing of this show is that it is connected to the legendary One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but you kind of forget about that as the series goes on. It's its own animal, for sure. Mark, what did you think?
Before I start spilling out my thoughts on Ratched, I just want to lay this out and say that I have not seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So when I came into the show, I had no image of who Mildred Ratched was prior to this portrayal of it. And like you, I'm very mixed on Ryan Murphy's output because while he's very good at making these pretty shows that are pretty because of both the visuals and also the people that are photogenic, they always have a certain air to them that makes it a little bit off to me. Like, I feel a little bit guilty when I end up enjoying a show that Ryan Murphy's touched. In fact, we even covered this a couple episodes ago with Hollywood. With Ratched, since I had no real image of Mildred Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I came into this with no real expectations of what the show was really wanting to be. And now that I've watched all the episodes so far, I think you nailed it when you said it's a delicious show. It's campy as hell. It is so unapologetic about some of its horror inspirations. At one point in the first couple episodes where it's playing classic intense horror music with one particular cue either sounding a lot like or is exactly the theme to Cape Fear, which is odd for a show like this to cover given that it isn't Cape Fear, but okay. But other than that, I had a lot of fun with this. I think this version of Mildred Ratched is really layered and interesting to follow. Sarah Paulson, working with Ryan Murphy again after American Horror Story, fits this particular incarnation perfectly. There's a lot of subplots that center around her character that cater a lot to Murphy's taste, particularly her relationship with Cynthia Nixon's character. And it just felt like this funhouse horror show that I enjoyed on its own terms. And there was not 1 second where I really thought about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It seems like from what I've seen, it doesn't look like they make that many nods to that movie other than it's a character that's from that movie. And that's about it. Other than that, it's a show that I had a lot of fun watching. I can't believe I'm saying this. This is probably the first Ryan Murphy related show that I fully enjoyed.
I'll do you one better. I think it's his best, and I don't think it suffers from being connected to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest because it doesn't try to make all those references. It just says, this is our version of Mildred Ratched. Deal with it. This is the story we're going for. A big problem that everyone here had with Hollywood was that it tried to bite off more than it could chew, especially in terms of its social commentary. But with this series, Ryan Murphy and Evan Romansky have a great deal of control when it comes to the sensitive topics they're discussing. Particularly, I really enjoyed the romance between Nurse Ratched and Gwendolyn Briggs. I thought it was incredibly well done. But also, a lot of the medical procedures they showed are mostly based in fact, and this series has more of an empathy for its mentally ill characters than you usually see in these sorts of shows. That is to say, a lot of the characters who are quote-unquote sane are a lot more over the top and layered in terms of the wacky storylines they get to have. I think the show's secret weapon is the fact that it makes every character just as despicable as they are completely empathetic to the viewer. And that creates this sense that, oh, am I going to hate this doctor this episode and then love him the next? It was just fun. It was just a really fun show to watch.
Something you nailed is how there are times where the quote-unquote sane people are crazier than the people who are there as patients. There's one episode where you just follow this young patient who doesn't really do much to harm people. He's just sitting there and he, from the face of it, seems like this normal kid. And then several episodes later, you learn about the doctor and some of the things that he's done in his past, which is infinitely crazier than anything someone who would be a patient at that facility would do. It was definitely unpredictable in that sense because of just the personalities that some of the characters that are saying that they gave off, because they definitely had their calmer moments too. I'm not going to lie. I definitely liked the character of Nurse Bucket, who was just there because she's so petty that Mildred Ratched is just climbing up higher and higher in the hierarchy, and just how much she wants to get back at her. For a show that involves a lot of these crazy characters and scenarios, I really like how often the show slows down to just hang out with its characters and just let them be as they are. Overall, I just think that Murphy and Romansky's approach to this, it was exactly right.
It's kind of interesting too. I mean, Netflix has kind of a track record of its shows not always looking amazing, but both this and Hollywood, I have to give big up to just the look of it. There were some moments in the show that visually just blew me away on a level that most movies don't. Also, thank God Murphy finally let Sarah Paulson be the lead. It was about time.
Yeah, in projects that involve Murphy and projects that don't, she's very much the supporting player. And we all know she's very talented. It's just that it's taken so long for her to really step into center stage.
I would say, however, that the two people who really stole the show are Finn Wittrock as Edmund Tollison and John Briones as Dr. Richard Hanover, who may or may not also have another identity. Those two characters, wow. Talk about this show just going, and Finn Wittrock's, they really just kind of allow him to chew scenery and go as over the top as he can, while also finding the humanity within this very twisted character. And with Briones, it's kind of the opposite. They let him be very understated and then slowly unspool who this man is inside, but yet still find a way to make us get into who he is as a human.
Both Finn Wittrock and John Briones are very good at what they do. I really like how the show gives them their own episodes to really develop as these sort of normal but completely insane people. I really like the episode with Wittrock, as we basically just spend time with him and one of the other nurses there. Even though it's a complete detour from everything else that's happened, it's also really good at showing how he could develop as a quote-unquote normal person while also still doing really crazy things. One other cast member I want to mention right now is Sophie Okonedo, who plays Charlotte Wells, and a bunch of other personalities that I can't remember the names of, but they definitely stuck into my head because Okonedo plays all these different characters so well. On the one hand, you have one personality that's basically this professional musician who's toured all over the place, and you have this one other person who is so hell-bent on killing Hitler, and you have regular Charlotte Wells, who's this very quiet and calm person. It's just seeing that acting transformation is just a blast. Anytime I see someone play a character with split personalities, I just can't get enough of it. Loved about James McAvoy in Split and Glass, the latter of which did have Sarah Paulson, and I would say the exact same thing about Okonedo. I think when she's introduced in the show about halfway through, it adds another layer of fun that I didn't really see coming.
Again, her character does speak to a lot of the empathy that the creators of the show have, is that her character could have been just such a stereotype of people with dissociative identity disorder, but it engages with it in a very meaningful way, and that particularly really worked. And also in the show, I mean, we could really talk all night about the great ensemble cast. I mean, when Corey Stoll and Vincent D'Onofrio are just a small part of the cast, you really are doing good there. The last cast member I think I want to mention, just because she was just such a riot in every scene she was in, was the legendary Sharon Stone as Lenore Osgood. Talk about someone who just blows up the scenery wherever she's in. Like, every scene she steps into turns into an absolute madhouse, and she has her pet monkey always on her shoulder. That was a lot of fun.
I'm just so happy to see Sharon Stone in another project again, because it's been so long since she's been in a project that was notable, and it's been even longer since she's been in a project that was good. The fact that she's in this, I like so many other things in the show. It just made me happy that she was there because of all the goofy things that episodes keep making her do. And the relationship that she has with her son is both delightful and disturbing at the same time.
Yes. And on that note, usually we would do a spoiler corner, but I think perhaps for Ratched, the best parts of the series are best left to the viewer to enjoy on their own. We will do a spoiler talk when season 2 comes out. So Mark, what are your final thoughts?
I'm not entirely sure where the show could go from here, but if season 2 is anything like season 1, I am so in.
I'm right there with you. I have nothing else to add. Ratched was a blast through and through. What would you rate this, Mark?
I would give it an 8 out of 10.
And I'll give it a 9 for a combined total of 8.5.
I'm cool with that.
I really gotta watch the show or finish it, anyways.
Yes, you do, dude. It's so good. I guess I'll go ahead and ask the question to wrap this up. What are y'all watching on Netflix currently?
I finished watching Hoops. I just finished Cobra Kai. The other shows that I'm currently watching are on our sponsors, competitors, so I can't talk about those. But Cobra Kai, we will definitely be discussing it whenever season 3 comes out. Me and Mark are on the bandwagon, and we are hoping to get James on there as well, and Katie.
I will be on there. Don't worry. The stuff that I've been watching on Netflix, I've not had as much time to watch Netflix or any of the other competitors at this time, but I have recently started The Haunting of Hill House, and that is A+. I can definitely see why it was so hyped, and I'm excited to finish that before we all eventually cover The Haunting of Bly Manor.
Pascal, you spoiled it for me because I was about to say that I also started watching Cobra Kai. I have to admit, basically everything else that I've seen has been on Netflix's competitors, so I can't really talk about them. The only other Netflix movie that I watched recently was something that I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about soon because it's Hubie Halloween.
Oh yeah, we're talking about that.
I'm not going to say anything right now, but I'll just let you know I did see that.
All right, guys. Well, I guess that wraps up this episode of Talking Netflix. We hope that you enjoyed this, and we will definitely see you guys back here soon for October.